Atlantic City, 1988. Inside one of the casino hotels along the boardwalk, a 21-year-old man who has just knocked out another human being in front of 30 million television viewers is sitting at a craps table at 2 in the morning with $60,000 in chips in front of him. He is wearing a silk shirt that costs more than most people in the city make in a month. He is laughing. He is buying rounds for strangers. He has been the heavyweight champion of the world for less than 2 years, and he has already made more money than everyone in this room combined. And he is throwing it across a felt table like it is confetti at a parade. And the feeling of the chips moving, of the dice flying, of the crowd around him growing louder every time he wins, is the closest thing he has found to the feeling of the fight itself. His name is Mike Tyson. He will earn $700 million across his professional career. He will also lose every dollar of it. $700 million. Gone. Not slowly, not in a single catastrophic wager, but in a sustained and creative dismantling of a fortune that should have been permanent. Through excess, through exploitation, through an addiction to the sensation of risk that the ring could not fully satisfy, and the casino was always ready to complete. When Mike Tyson filed for bankruptcy in 2003, he listed debts of $23 million against essentially no assets. The man who had earned more money than any boxer in the history of the sport to that point was, at 36 years old, technically broke. This is the story of Mike Tyson, the most feared fighter of his generation, possibly of all time, and the most spectacular financial self-destruction in the history of American sport. It is a story about poverty and power, and what happens when a human being is handed everything and has never been taught how to hold it. It begins as the best and worst American stories begin in Brooklyn. Brownsville, Brooklyn, 1966. The neighborhood had already acquired the reputation it would carry for decades. Poor, crowded, violent, a place where the options available to a young man were narrow, and the consequences of choosing wrong were permanent. Lorna Tyson raised her children there with limited resources and, by most accounts, limited presence. Mike's father was not in the picture. The father figure who would shape him most profoundly would not appear until Mike was a teenager, and by then he had already absorbed years of a street education that left marks that no amount of money ever fully erased. He was a small, chubby child who was teased and robbed and beaten. Then he was a young teenager who began fighting back. Then he was a teenager who could not stop fighting, who was arrested for the first time at age 11, who cycled through juvenile detention facilities with a frequency that, in anyone else, would have predicted a permanent criminal future. In 1980, when Mike Tyson was 13 years old, he was sent to the Tryon School for Boys, a residential reform facility in upstate New York. And there, through a connection that would change the course of his life and the course of heavyweight boxing history, he was introduced to a man named Bobby Stewart, a former professional boxer who worked at the facility. Stewart recognized something. He made a call. The man he called was Cus D'Amato. Constantine D'Amato was 72 years old and had been one of the most respected trainers and managers in boxing history. He had guided Floyd Patterson to the heavyweight title. He was living in semi-retirement in Catskill, New York, and he had been saying for years that he could take a young fighter and make a heavyweight champion. When he first saw Mike Tyson spar, he is reported to have said, quietly, to the people standing near him, that he was looking at the next heavyweight champion of the world. Cus D'Amato took Mike in, literally. Mike moved into D'Amato's house in Catskill, where D'Amato lived with his companion Camille Ewald. For a boy who had grown up without a stable home, without a father, without anyone whose belief in him was unconditional, the effect of this arrangement was profound. D'Amato was not merely a trainer. He was a replacement for everything Mike's early life had withheld. Structure, discipline, the daily ritual of the gym, the sense that his gifts, and they were extraordinary gifts, a combination of speed and power and spatial intelligence that D'Amato recognized immediately as generational, were real, were valued, were capable of producing something. Mike trained with an intensity that alarmed people who witnessed it. He was in the gym before dawn. He ran miles in the dark. He studied film of the old fighters. He absorbed D'Amato's philosophy, the peekaboo style, the aggressive bobbing movement, the short explosive punches thrown from angles that conventional opponents had no framework for anticipating. He did not just learn boxing, he became it. There was one thing missing from D'Amato's education of Mike Tyson, and it was not D'Amato's fault that it was missing. It was simply outside the old trainer's expertise, and perhaps outside his imagination. D'Amato taught Mike how to fight. He did not teach Mike how to handle money. He did not teach Mike how to protect himself from the industry that was about to close around a young man of his talent like a fist. He did not teach Mike that the world beyond the ring contained opponents as dangerous as any heavyweight and considerably more difficult to see coming. Mike turned professional in 1985. By then, something devastating had already happened. In November of that year, Cus D'Amato died of pneumonia. He was 77 years old. He did not live to see the championship he had predicted. Mike Tyson was 19 years old, and the one person in his life who had served as anchor, compass, and protector was gone. He kept fighting. He had no other framework. He had been built for the ring, and the ring was what he had. He tore through the heavyweight division with a speed that had not been seen in the sport's modern era. Opponents were knocked out in the first round, in the second, in the third. His combinations were too fast to track with the eye. His punching angles arrived from positions that experienced fighters described as geometrically impossible to defend. His face in the ring was expressionless, the face of a man who had been trained to make violence a technical exercise. On November 22, 1986, Mike Tyson knocked out Trevor Berbick in the second round in Las Vegas to become the World Boxing Council heavyweight champion of the world. He was 20 years old. He was the youngest heavyweight champion in history. He would hold a version of the title for the next 3 years. He was also, from almost the first moment the money arrived, completely unprepared to manage it. The sums came fast. The early fights generated hundreds of thousands of dollars. The major fights generated tens of millions. He signed with promoter Don King in 1988, a decision that would later be the subject of years of litigation. King was the most prominent boxing promoter of his era, and depending on who you asked, either a necessary evil or simply an evil. Mike later claimed in lawsuits and in interviews that Don King had stolen from him systematically, that contracts had been structured in ways that directed money away from Tyson and toward King's own pockets, that the full accounting of what Tyson earned versus what he received was a number that would, if fully revealed, represent one of the most significant financial crimes in the history of professional sports. By some estimates, Tyson earned over $300 million in the first phase of his career, the years from 1985 to his imprisonment in 1992. The money came from fight purses, from endorsements, from ancillary rights. It was a number that should have been, if properly managed, the foundation of generational wealth. Instead, it was spent. Not all of it on gambling, that must be said clearly. Mike Tyson's financial catastrophe was a multi-front disaster. The gambling was one front, the spending was another, the exploitation by those around him was a third. All three worked simultaneously, and each one accelerated the others. The spending was first and most visible. Tyson bought houses, not one, not two, but multiple simultaneously. He owned a mansion in Connecticut, a property in Ohio, real estate in various locations, all maintained at enormous ongoing expense. He filled these properties with things: custom cars, motorcycles, gold fixtures, furniture imported from places he had never visited, art purchased by people on his behalf without serious consideration of whether it would hold value. He bought jewelry on a scale that casino gift shops could not accommodate, custom pieces, massive diamonds, gold everywhere. He bought tigers, not metaphorically. Bengal tigers, living in enclosures on his property, maintained by handlers whose salaries he paid. 3 of them. He reportedly spent more than $500,000 on the tigers and their ongoing care. He loved them. He was photographed with them. They were, in a way that made complete psychological sense for a man who had been raised in Brownsville and had survived by projecting invincibility, the ultimate expression of who he had decided he was. He also gave money away, lavishly, impulsively, constantly, to people from his old neighborhood, to people who claimed to be from his old neighborhood, to friends, to hangers-on, to strangers who approached him with problems he could solve with a check. He could not say no. He did not want to say no. The money had always seemed, in some fundamental way, unreal to him. Numbers on a page rather than a finite resource with a bottom. This is the crucial thing about Tyson's relationship with money that explains what came next. He had gone from having nothing to having everything in too short a time, without the intermediate experience that most wealthy people accumulate. The years of managing, of budgeting, of understanding what money actually is. For him, it was a current. It flowed in and it flowed out, and it had always flowed in faster than it flowed out. And the idea that the inflow could slow or stop was simply not a reality he had integrated. The gambling ran alongside all of this. It was not, in the early years, the dominant story. The dominant story was the fights and the spending and the increasingly chaotic personal life. But it was there, consistent and growing. The casinos of Atlantic City and Las Vegas knew Mike Tyson the way they knew every whale of his era. As a man whose relationship with money was impulsive, whose ego required the biggest bets available, and whose presence at a table generated the kind of ambient excitement that made other patrons bet more, stay longer, order another drink. He was a natural gambler in the most specific sense, a man for whom the risk itself was the point. He had spent his entire professional life in a state of consequence. Every moment in the ring mattered. Every second carried the potential for sudden and total reversal. The casino replicated that structure. The dice in his hand, the chips on the table, the moment before the result was known. These things activated something in him that ordinary life, with its slowness and its ambiguity, could not. He lost large at the tables, tens of thousands in a night, sometimes hundreds of thousands. There were nights in Atlantic City, and later as the fight purses continued coming in, nights in Las Vegas, where Tyson reportedly lost sums that would have been catastrophic for any ordinary person, and that, even for him, required a fight purse to replace. He would win a fight for $10 million, and weeks later, a significant portion of that $10 million would be distributed across casino floors, clothing stores, car dealerships, and the outstretched hands of the people around him. By the early 1990s, the machine was under strain. The public did not see it yet. The fights were still happening, the money was still coming in, the image of invincibility was still largely intact. But inside the operation of Tyson's financial life, there were already warning signs that the people who should have been paying attention were not, or were choosing not to. In February of 1992, everything changed publicly and permanently. Mike Tyson was convicted of rape in Indianapolis, Indiana. The trial had been covered globally. The verdict sent him to prison. He was sentenced to 6 years, serving 3 before his release in 1995. The years in prison were, in financial terms, years of continued drain without income. The legal costs of the trial and appeal were enormous. The properties continued to require maintenance. The people around him continued to be paid. The money was moving out while the primary source of income, the fight purses, had stopped. He came back. He always came back. In 1995, lean and focused after 3 years of enforced discipline, he stepped back into the ring and was terrifying again. He reclaimed portions of the heavyweight title. The purses resumed. He earned $30 million for fighting Frank Bruno in 1996. He earned $30 million again for the first Evander Holyfield fight, which he lost. He earned $35 million for the rematch, the fight in which, in the 3rd round, he bit off a piece of Holyfield's ear, was disqualified, and was temporarily banned from boxing. $35 million for the rematch. Gone within months. The bite, the disqualification, the ban. These events crystallized something that the public had been sensing for years, that the man inside Mike Tyson's body was not the same man who had stalked opponents in 1986 with the cold precision of a machine. Something had been breaking steadily across the years of wealth and trauma and exploitation in prison, and the bite was what the breaking looked like from the outside. He kept fighting after the ban was lifted. He needed the money. This is the part of the story that sits uncomfortably alongside the mythology. The greatest heavyweight of his era, fighting in his mid-30s, not because he loved the sport or had anything left to prove, but because the money was gone, and fighting was the only trade he knew. He lost to Lennox Lewis in 2002 in a fight that most observers believed he had no real chance of winning. He earned $15 million. He lost in the 8th round. There was no $24 million, There was no 5-year plan. There was a man who had earned $700 million fighting because the alternative was financial collapse, which arrived anyway in 2003 when he formally filed for bankruptcy. The bankruptcy filing listed debts in excess of $23 million. Among the creditors, the Internal Revenue Service, to whom he owed back taxes across multiple years, a limousine company, hotels, credit lines extended by financial institutions who had presumably believed that a man earning his kind of money represented a reasonable risk. The filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. It was merely the formal acknowledgement of a reality that had been building for 15 years. What the bankruptcy filing could not capture in numbers was the human cost of what had happened. The houses were gone or going. The cars had been sold. The tigers, beloved by Tyson in a way that seemed to embarrass him when people asked about it, were eventually relocated to animal sanctuaries. The jewelry was auctioned. The entourage had dispersed. Those who had been there for the abundance were largely not present for the accounting. In the years after the bankruptcy, Tyson spoke with increasing candor about the scale of what had happened. He acknowledged the gambling. He acknowledged the spending. He acknowledged that he had been surrounded for much of his peak earning years by people whose relationship to his money was parasitic, who took because he was offering, and who offered because he was the kind of man who needed to give. He sued Don King, eventually reaching an undisclosed settlement that the sport widely understood as an acknowledgement that the financial relationship between the two men had not been what it should have been. He sued, and was sued by, so many people across so many years that the litigation itself became a kind of occupation, a second career conducted in conference rooms rather than arenas, with lawyers rather than cornermen, and with outcomes that were almost uniformly less satisfying than the ones in the ring. He became, in the public imagination of the 2000s and 2010s, a different kind of figure than he had been in the 80s and 90s. The invincibility was gone. What replaced it was something more complicated and, to many people, more interesting. A man who had seen everything, lost everything, and was trying to make sense of what he had lived through. He appeared in films. He performed a one-man show on Broadway, in which he talked about his life with a rawness that audiences found genuinely startling. He started a podcast. He raised horses. He grew marijuana legally in California. He married for the third time and appeared, by most external measures, to have found a version of peace that the earlier decades had not offered him. He talked about Cus D'Amato constantly, the trainer who died in 1985, before the championship, before the money, before everything that followed. He talked about D'Amato the way you talk about someone whose absence has shaped every subsequent year of your life. He said that D'Amato would have protected him. He said that without D'Amato, there was no one to tell him no. And without someone to tell him no, the money went the only direction a river without banks can go. There is something in that observation that reaches further than Mike Tyson's biography. The financial architecture of professional boxing in the 1980s and 90s was not designed to protect fighters. It was designed to extract maximum value from them during their peak earning years, with minimal obligation to their long-term welfare. The promoters, the managers, the hangers-on, the casinos, the car dealerships, the jewelers, all of them understood that the window of a heavyweight champion's earning power was finite, and all of them had efficient systems for accessing that window while it was open. Mike Tyson was not an exception to the system. He was its most spectacular exhibit. $700 million, earned over approximately 18 years of professional boxing, from 1985 to 2005, spent through a combination of personal excess, professional exploitation, criminal legal costs, civil litigation, compulsive gambling, compulsive generosity, and a complete absence of the financial education that might have produced a different outcome. Gone, formally, by 2003, when the bankruptcy court received its filing and the public finally had a number to attach to what had been visible for years. He is still alive. He's in his late 50s now. He returned to boxing in 2024 for an exhibition match against Jake Paul, a social media personality who had become a professional boxer, a fight that generated enormous viewership and divided opinion sharply, but that reminded the world briefly that whatever else Mike Tyson is, he is still a name that stops a room. He has not recovered the $700 million. He has not tried, in any serious sense, to recover it. The businesses he has built in his post-bankruptcy life are modest by comparison, designed for sustainability rather than scale. He lives more quietly than he once did. He has said in various interviews over the years that he does not miss the money itself as much as people assume. What he misses, he has suggested, is something money cannot buy and never could: the clarity of being inside the ring, where everything that mattered was immediate and physical and honest. The casino floor is not honest in that way. The dice do not care who is throwing them. The cards do not know who the heavyweight champion of the world is. The house edge applies to everyone equally, to the man with $60,000 in chips and a silk shirt sitting at a craps table in Atlantic City at 2 in the morning in 1988, laughing and buying rounds for strangers and throwing chips like confetti. The money runs out, the edge remains. That is the one fact that $700 million cannot change.